No. Good evening, folks. Welcome to Southport Whisky Club on a Wednesday night, end of March. Had some fine weather at Southport. Hope you have elsewhere in the country. Almost put my shorts on yesterday. I'll be getting my summer hat out fairly soon. We've got a wee bit of a world exclusive here. I was just talking to Scott, and Tomatin have never done an end-to-end distillery cask tasting like this. So I'm delighted because, as sound like a stuck record sometimes, I love Tomatin whiskey. We've got Scott and we've got Stan with us tonight. How are you, Stan?
I'm fine, and I just want 5 minutes before Scott kicks off. It won't even be 5 minutes, it'll be 3.
Okay. And what about you, Scott? Okay. You all right?
I'm very good, thanks, Victor. I'm very good. Good to see you all. Good stuff,
good stuff. Right, we're in with the big stuff tonight. Go on, Stan, you do your stuff.
Well, I'd just like to say good evening to everybody. Are there any ladies there tonight, by the way?
Yep.
Excellent. Good. That's great news. Well done. Lovely to see everybody there. All 25 of you there, is there? Okay.
There's about 20.
I'd just like to say welcome to Southport, really, and thanks very much indeed for the support you've given Tomatin and Cabochen, for that matter, over the years, especially at this lockdown time as well, which has been very difficult for us all. I'll also like to sort of have a wee dram to my colleague, my friend, Alistair Much, who was a UK sales director. And I've known Alistair for over 30 years, and we've worked for many a year with him. So enjoy your retirement, Alistair. And I'm just going to have a little dram here to say slange.
Slange.
Any excuse for a dram at Tomatin.
I agree.
And that's a Virgin cask as well. Lovely. Now, given that Alice has hung his boots up, I'd like to say hello to Gordon tonight, Gordon Hind, who Gordon is going to be replacing Alistair. Lives up in Glasgow. And I'm certainly welcome Gordon on the 19th of April. And I look forward to working with you, boss. And I'm sure we'll have a successful year.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
No problem. Another slange.
Slange. So this is your new boss, Stan?
Sorry?
This is your new boss that's on tonight?
That was him there.
Right, okay. Well.
He's been in a business for 15 years. He's very well-rounded, obviously, and I'm sure he'll fit in well and enjoy Tomatin.
Okay, well,
we'll
behave ourselves tonight.
Scott, I know how good Scott is, but just to sort of add a bit more clout to it, on the 5th of February last month, Scott was awarded Scotch Whisky Brand Ambassador of the Year with Icons of Whisky Award in Scotland. Scott, again, cheers.
That's all, Scott. Well done.
Starting to see why Stan's got his camera off. He's had 3 glasses of whiskey within a 2 minutes.
Keeping it off. I'm leaving it off. It's all over to you.
Perfect.
Anyway, but not only that, he's actually also in the finals of the global awards as well.
No, I lost that one, Stan.
Okay, but it's great to be in the final, I can tell you. And us Scots know how to lose in finals if we ever get there. Okay. And really, I'd just like to say, thanks for tonight, Scott. I'm really looking forward to this. I've got a couple of drams myself. I haven't got the ones that everybody's tasting tonight, but I've got a glass of the excellent Fino, and I'll follow it up with a glass of the Decades as well. So, Scott, I'm going to just hand it over to you. Look at you all. You didn't need to see my face. I'll watch and learn, as they say.
Perfect. Thank you, Stan. Thank you. Like I say, great to be back in front of Southport Whisky Club, and great to see a few familiar faces as well. It was I don't quite know what Victor has got on Stan. I don't know what kind of dirt he's got on him, but every so often I get a phone call from Stan telling me that we're going to be doing another tasting for Southport Whisky Club, and it's always one of these lineups that is just, it's a brand ambassador's dream, because I don't have to speak about the whiskies very much because they do it all themselves. Tonight, as Vic said, we are doing the Tomatin Distillery exclusives, all 5 of them. These are whiskies that up until last year were only available at the distillery, at the visitor centre. The only time we ever really tasted them was at the end of our top tier tour at the distillery, the warehouse tour at Tomatin. And then with everything that happened with COVID, we decided to make them available to buy through the online store, but we've not actually held a tasting with them. We've not really pushed them, because what we're trying to do over the last year, as well as continue the business, is definitely help our retailers. So we would often be tasting the bottles that they already had in stock, but Victor has managed to wrangle a good amount of stock of this and pull together an excellent tasting. So well done again, Victor, for pulling this together. I'm delighted to be tasting these whiskies with you. But I was speaking to Graham Mackay from Adelphi earlier this week, and he was telling me that he had a couple of Adelphi tastings lined up with you, I think in April. And I'm not ashamed to say it, it was the first time I've ever been jealous of someone from Inverness. Not just because he's getting to do a double header with you, but because when he's got a lineup, it's always a new distillery or a new whiskey that he's able to talk about as an independent bottler. This is the 3rd Tomatin tasting that we've done with Southport Whisky Club in the last 12 months, which again, thank you for the support. But I think most people already kind of know the Tomatin story now and are already familiar with a bit about the background of the distillery and whatnot. So when I was looking at the whiskies tonight, I thought, we'll talk a little bit about the concept of distillery exclusives, but that will last all of 5 minutes. And then, you know, I don't want to bore you by telling you the history of Tomatin all over again. What I would like to do, though, is talk about a subject within whiskey that I'm incredibly passionate about and incredibly interested in, and I hope you will be as well, because it's a subject that is incredibly important but isn't really talked about that much, and that is the history of Scotch whiskey maturation. I think everyone knows the Cliff Notes: 19th century sherry casks, 20th century bourbon casks, 21st century every distillery is trying to one-up each other with the weirdest and most wonderful casks available. But what I kind of want to talk about is, how true is that? Where did that come from? Why did that happen that way? And really get into that, if that's something that interests you. If not, we can talk about anything you want. But if you're interested in that, we can absolutely do that. Look for some thumbs up or thumbs down.
Let's do that. Let's see where we go.
Thumbs up.
It's a fairly open club. You should get a good bit of conversation. But
Brilliant.
what I suggest is that we start on the first whiskey, because we're 13 minutes in, and I'm thirsty.
Whiskey Wednesday, 13 minutes in. I can't believe it. I mean, I've been sipping on a wee highball there, but it doesn't really it just wets the whistle for 5 cask strength single casks, doesn't it? So let's get into the first one. The order that we're going to taste the whiskey tonight really follows no kind of structure, other than it ties in well to the history that we'll talk about. We're going to start off with the Bourbon Cask. We're going to move on to the Virgin Oak Cask. Then we're going to go into the Oloroso Sherry Cask. Then we're going to go right up to the 1990, and then we're going to finish on the Pedro Ximenez Cask. So hopefully what I've just said actually matches the labels you've got on your sample bottles there. Yeah, excellent. So the first whiskey that we're going to have is the Bourbon Cask. This is from 2007. It's 13 and a half years old, and it is sitting at 55.3% ABV. For me, Tomatin, certainly modern Tomatin, is at home in a bourbon cask. It belongs in a bourbon cask. Up until the 1960s, Tomatin was a lightly peated spirit. And at that time, we would have been using sherry casks, a lot of refill casks. But since that time, Tomatin moved to becoming this lightly fruity, kind of what we expect from Tomatin today, is sweet, fruity, and it really, really works wonders in bourbon casks. And everything in our core range has some involvement of bourbon casks. So Legacy is bourbon and Virgin Oak, 12-year-old is bourbon and sherry, the 14-year-old is bourbon and port casks. So it works wonders with the whiskies. Now, I'm not going to be the sort of person that's going to be talking too much about tasting notes or anything like that. I'm very much of the opinion that you'll smell what you smell yourself, and I don't want to put you off that, but I would like to hear your thoughts on it. But in terms of the casks themselves, we work with 2 cooperages for our bourbon casks. We work with the Speyside cooperage, and we also work with a cooperage over in Kentucky itself. And we use the Kentucky cooperage, the Kelvin cooperage over in Kentucky for the majority of our bourbon casks. But we also use Speyside because if we ever need more than we thought we did, it's a lot quicker to go to the guys at Speyside than it is to go to the guys in Kentucky, and we'll get these barrels in. When we're looking for bourbon barrels, we are looking for casks that have held bourbon for around about 3 years. I think I often say that it would be a brilliant thing from a marketing point of view to say that we've used, Pappy Van Winkle or 18-year-old Elijah Craig casks and stuff like that. But simply put, there wouldn't be a huge amount of oak influence left in those casks because the bourbon would have taken so much of it out there. So we're looking for younger bourbons. We use a lot of Heaven Hill casks. We use a lot of Four Roses casks, and they just give us still that lovely wood influence that we're looking for from the American oak. All that vanillas, coconuts, creams, and it just stacks up wonderfully with the kind of apple, pear, rhubarb flavor of the Tomatin spirit. What's everyone's kind of initial thoughts on this whiskey?
It tastes like one of the best Tomatins I've ever had. Because I think Tomatin does work really well in bourbon. I think it's just the classic way for it to go. You can still taste the gentle note of the spirit, but it's a full fat Tomatin.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's like some distilleries have a very clear kind of sherry influence to them, but Tomatin's always got that bourbon element. It's what really allows the citrus notes of our spirit to shine through. In fact, tonight, the sherry, the Oloroso that you're going to try, is one of the very, very rare examples of a Tomatin fully matured in sherry. And it's an excellent whiskey, but you'll see why that's the case, because as you just said there, Victor, these bourbon casks really allow the distillery character to shine through. And that's not necessarily something that we get with heavy, heavy doses of sherry cask or things like that. So while you're trying that, I'll dive into a wee bit about what the distillery exclusives are all about and how they came about. I mean, we're by no means the only distillery in Scotland to have distillery exclusives. Far from it. You always get things like the Fish Isle bottlings. You get Glengoyne have the wonderful teapot dram, and a lot of distilleries nowadays have some form of exclusive for the distillery, and it's really a way of kind of thanking everyone for making the journey to these distilleries a lot of the time. But for us, it all came about back in 2011. Our master distiller, Graham Unson, when he was employed back in 2011 as distillery manager, showed up to work for the first day and found out that the visitor centre was part of his remit. And I don't necessarily know if he knew that was the case when he accepted the job. He's a production guy through and through. But the visitor centre and the team there was going to fall under his kind of guidance as well, which is quite a unique situation. I think at most distilleries, the visitor centre is very much an extension of marketing. But back in 2011, we didn't have a marketing department. Our first marketing employee joined in 2012. So the visitor centre fell under Graham. And the result of that is that our tours and everything that we do is naturally quite educational and information led. We want you to leave the distillery with an understanding of how we've made that whiskey and how that whiskey has come into existence, not what the brand is or what the story is. It's more about how we produce the whiskey. So you can go inside our old mash tun, for example. It's the only distillery in Scotland where you can actually go inside a mash tun. You can see a deconstructed condenser, and hopefully after all these lockdowns, you'll be able to see an opened up mill and see how all that works. And Graham thought, we're doing this on the tour. Is there any way we can do this in the whiskey itself? And so in around about, I think it was early 2013, we put a 12-year-old bourbon cask and a 12-year-old sherry cask in the visitor centre as a bottle your own. And the idea was very much, let's let people see the two elements that go into making the Tomatin 12-year-old, but also how widely different whiskey can become in the same period of time just by different cask types. And they were incredibly successful. Kind of sales of the core range plummeted, but these two casks in the visitor centre started selling like hotcakes. And we were asked, could you put more casks in there? And we said, well, there's no reason why not. So over the last few years, we've got to the point where we have 5 casks in the visitor centre, and they're pretty interesting. So the way it works is the 5 casks that actually sit in the visitor centre are 54-litre casks that were constructed by one of the cooperages we work with out in Jerez, and they sit there in the visitor centre, and they're active casks. So at a lot of distilleries, you'll see the distillery exclusive is already bottled. It's a kind of a bottling for the distillery. And at most of the places where you bottle from a cask, the cask has a steel-lined container inside it, so that once the whiskey goes in, it stops maturing. But at Tomatin, these are active pieces of wood, and the whiskey is continuing to mature until the moment it hits the bottle that you're filling. And so the way it'll work is that Graham will select the casks that he wants to use. So take this bourbon cask, for example. He would have tried a range of samples and then selected this as the final cask. That cask is around about 225 litres in capacity. So it will be moved to warehouse 13, which is right next to the visitor centre. And then the guys will go in with a tube and they will siphon off some of the liquid into a 20-litre drum. They'll carry it over to the visitor centre and they'll top up the cask. And as the cask depletes, they'll top it up again until the mother cask is emptied and we have to select the next one. It's really as analog as that. There's no kind of fancy technology or anything like that. It is taking liquid out of a cask and putting it into another one, which is really, really cool, because although the casks in the visitor centre have been used time and time again and aren't really adding any flavour, the strength fluctuates until the time it's bottled. So we have to be constantly taking strength readings. You'll see on things like the 1990 that we're going on to, it's been there for around about 4 years now. So bottle one to the bottle that you have are widely different because there's so much more oxidation going on. So it's really cool to have that living cask in the visitor centre. And if you, the bottles that you guys have there would have been bottled at the time that you purchased them. It's the reason that we have the bottled date on the label, because it's different for every bottle that comes out. So I don't know if you know what date that was there, Victor, that you got those ones.
I think they're dated February. I don't have one with me. I've just got the samples here, but somebody will have one of those bottles. What's the date on them? I'm pretty sure it's February 2021.
Excellent.
I got a 1990 from the distillery 3 years ago, and exactly what you said. In fact, I got it in 2019, and it's got the distill date and it's got the bottle date in 2019, and the one I got last month as part of this is the same 1990, same distilled date, and it's 2021. So actually, I've gained. I've gone over that magic 30-year-old number.
Yep.
Which is kind of cool.
It is kind of cool. It also helps us, it's by no means the cheapest whiskey in the world. I think it's £375 a bottle. That sounds an awful lot cheaper for a 30-year-old than it does for a 29-year-old for some strange reason. It sounds slightly more acceptable now, but yeah, I think when we get to that, you'll understand how wonderful that whiskey is, despite whatever numbers on the bottle. But
let's get some opinions on this one.
Aye.
Who have we got? Mr. Bourbon Rich.
Yep.
Always got something to say about bourbon casks.
I clearly bought a bottle of this, and I was worried when I decanted them all earlier, and it was the lightest one, because if you buy with your eyes, I was terrified. And I don't know that much about Scotch either, but I'm delighted. It's beautiful. I think it's everything I love about whiskey, not just Scotch, but it's got good mouthfeel for me as well. I like that thickness it's got in there. And that's all that butter that you're getting out of the bourbon cask and that oak. I don't suppose you know, is it first fill after bourbon?
Yeah, first fill this one. Yeah. In fact, everything that we're trying tonight is first fill.
So I'm surprised it is so pale given the amount of flavour in it. So that teaches me a valuable lesson. So there we go.
Don't buy with the eyes.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, what I've often noticed with Tomatin and bourbon casks, the darker it is, the less kind of distillery character is in there. You do get a lot of Tomatins and bourbon casks that are much more vanilla, butter, toffee, whereas this definitely has all that fruit there, especially at cask strength.
Yeah, and I'm getting that hint of smokiness on it, that sort of dulled down peat, which I do adore. I'm sort of really attracted to. Not really in your face peat, but that sort of in the background sort of flavour. So yeah, it's lovely.
Yeah.
What about Mr. Chris Jock? What do you think of this? This for a kickoff?
Phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. I think it's do you know what? I was kind of bemoaning the other day how few decent bourbon cask whiskies I've had lately. It's all finishes, but this is just, I could drink this all day. I bought the Oloroso, and I'm slightly regretting not popping this in as well now.
Well, what we've done is we've filled the shop because Stan has assured me that if anybody buys any tonight, we can get a few more sent down from the distillery. So
I'll be picking one of these up. This is great.
They're back in stock. And they'll probably have a different fill date from the ones on the 15th of February.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment there, Chris. I mean, this is a 13-year-old whiskey, and it's £75, so it's definitely the upper limit of what you'd expect for that sort of age. But being that it's a single cask, being that it is cask strength, and being that it is a great example of what a bourbon cask single malt can be, I think that's perfect. I mean, I've spoken to Graham Unson about this whiskey numerous times, and for him, and I would say I agree, this is that sort of desert island style. If I had to pick a style of whiskey that I had to drink for the rest of my life, for me, this would be it. Luckily, nobody is ever forced to make that decision, and we've got 5 belters in front of us. But yeah, I'll jump a little bit into the kind of the history a wee bit, and kind of a little bit of background as to why it's become such a subject that I've been researching. So my background, before I started working in the whiskey industry, I studied Scottish history at the University of the Highlands and Islands. So history is very much my first love, and not necessarily reading what other people have written about history, but actually looking at archives and trying to draw conclusions from the little threads of information that you get from those archives. And that's what led me to Tomatin, and my first job there was researching the distillery's history. And I then moved into a commercial role, and in 2016 I was upstairs, actually in the attic of our visitor centre, which is not somewhere that I typically find myself. And as you would expect, it's full of old kind of tourist books and old marketing material and like shop displays and stuff. But over in a corner, there was a big tome of a book, a big dusty old book. And a little bit like Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade, kind of rummaging about for the Holy Grail, I made a beeline for it and dusted off the spine of it. And it was one of those moments where your jaw just slams off the deck, because what it said on it was warehouse book #1 Tomatin distillery. I was like, wow, what is this? And I opened it up, and it was a record of every cask filled at Tomatin between 1909 and 1929. What went into the cask, who the cask was sold to, and more importantly, in kind of the modern conversation, what the cask previously held. And what really shook me was the variety on offer. I think, you know, we're often led to believe that this kind of experimentation and exploration of different cask types is quite a modern thing. But when I was looking in that, there was sherry casks, bourbon casks, port casks, marsala, rum, brandy. The list was endless, and I was really kind of taken aback by it. And it got me questioning, what were people's true attitudes towards maturation back at this time? And then as I looked into that, I started asking the question, when did we actually start maturing whiskey? I think everyone's quite familiar of that infamous 1494 date when James IV grants Friar John Corr 8 balls of malt with which to make aquavitae, you know, that kind of the dawn of Scotch whiskey. And that's quite a popular date. And, you know, 8 balls of malt was enough to make 3,000 bottles of whiskey. So let's not kid ourselves that this was the first time we ever did it, but it was definitely the birthplace of Scotch whiskey. But I'm curious, can anyone tell me when the first record of a cask influencing whiskey was made? Because for me, it's almost a more important date, because the aquavitae that was being made is very, very different to what we have as whiskey today. But the first record of a cask influencing whiskey, that's when we start to get what we're drinking today. It was made in 1822, which, to put it in perspective, that was 328 years after the first record of whiskey. Just to dial in on that a little bit more, it's only 199 years since that date. So whiskey was being made for longer without maturation than it's been matured for. And it's a great little memoir. A woman called Elizabeth Grant. So, you know, a big topic at the moment is important women in whiskey, and this is a really big one. Elizabeth Grant of Rothiemurchus was responsible for attending to King George IV on his visit to Edinburgh in 1822. And when he was asking for whiskey, she gave him a bottle of Glenlivet. Not necessarily the Glenlivet that we know today. Glenlivet was basically Speyside at the time. And she recorded that it was long in oak, smooth like milk. That's the first record of a piece of wood influencing a liquid, influencing a whiskey, sorry. And so I was asking, you know, up until 1822, what was happening? And the truth of the matter is not very much. At that point in time, whiskey was largely made illegally. It was a cottage industry. It was an extension of the agricultural industry. It would be poured from the still into a flask and consumed. And on the rare occasion that it did go into a cask, it was taken straight to a pub where it was sold directly. There was no call for warehousing. I mean, if you're making whiskey illegally and the excise officer is looking to confiscate your whiskey, the last thing you want is a big warehouse saying, we're here, you know. So up until 1822, there was really no maturation. And then in 1823, that all changes. The Excise Act is passed. All of a sudden, whiskey production moves away from the fields and into industry. And whiskey starts being sold on a scale bigger than before. It's no longer okay just to sell it to the local market. People start selling it south of the border into England. And by that point in time, rum and brandy were already pretty well established in England. So the kind of educated, wealthier palate had an expectation of wood maturation. At that time, 10% of imports into Scotland were wood. Scotland has, you know, you see all the photos and it's got loads of forestry and stuff, but relatively speaking, we're a small country with not a lot of wood, so we had to import it all. And all of the timber used for barrels was from America. So it would have made sense that we kind of try and replicate almost the style of whiskey that we just had, and make something similar to that rum kind of palate. But just a year before that, the Scottish herring industry exploded. The Scots had found a new way to cure herring, and it took over Europe. And so all the American oak was being used there. The whiskey that we're going to go on to is kind of what would have happened if the herring industry hadn't exploded at that time, and the Scottish distillers did get access to this new American oak. What we're going to go on to is the Virgin Oak Distillery exclusive. And this is probably going to be the most divisive whiskey of the evening. Some people will love it and some people will hate it. It's 6 years old, distilled in 2015, and it's 62.3% ABV. So this is definitely one that after that kind of first nose and sip, add a drop of water into it, because if not, you're just going to numb your palate. I personally think this is fascinating, and it kind of dials into what we're trying to do with the distillery exclusives, which is styles of Tomatin that you won't otherwise find, and styles of Tomatin that tell you a little bit about how our core range is constructed. Tomatin Legacy, which I'm sure some of you have tried, I'm sure some of you have even got a bottle in your house, is a combination of bourbon barrels and Virgin Oak Casks. So it's a combination of these first two whiskies. But when you speak to Graham about this, he refers to it as a mid-Atlantic whiskey. And what he means is that the whiskey, the spirit, is a malt spirit from Scotland, but the maturation is what you would expect of a bourbon producer. 6 years in a new American oak charred cask.
I need to go back to Bourbon Rich now and see if he agrees with you.
He was just swallowing his first mouthful of it. How long is it? 6 years, you say?
6 years, yep.
It's pretty good for 6 years, especially in a Scottish climate.
Yep.
Because that's probably what, about 27 minutes in Kentucky?
Yeah, yeah, at most. Especially at Tomatin, where we're 315 meters above sea level, very little evaporation and stuff like that, you know?
I think that's splendid as well, if I'm honest. I think it performs a little bit like a bourbon, but it's the spirit. The spirit's too good. I think I'd like to try your spirit before it goes in any barrel. I think
we can sort that out at some point. Yeah. I'm sure.
What about you, Martin? What do you make of this one?
Definitely a lot richer than the previous one. Loads of vanilla. Quite tannic for me. I quite like that. Very bourbon-esque, I think. I definitely got that on the nose. I like it.
You like it?
It draws quite a lot of moisture out of your mouth, which bourbons don't do. Bourbons normally wrap you in creamy, you don't need to drink any water. This is like, almost, don't want to do you any injustice here. This is just a note, like sucking on a lemon.
Yeah.
That sort of parchiness to my mouth, but it's not like sucking on a lemon. Let me just make that clear.
But you're absolutely right. Sorry, on you go, Martin.
I was saying that'd be the tannins probably giving you that dryness. It's that new wood.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think obviously the massive difference between bourbon and Scotch is, single malt is that it's purely malted barley, where the maize and all these other grains will give a bourbon weight and oiliness that just coat the mouth. We're working with barley here, and even when you do try a new mixed spirit, it has quite a drying sort of thing because it's not had time to draw some of the flavors out of the wood that give that sweetness. So yeah, absolutely, I agree with that. I think for me, the great analogy here is that when I went to Rome on my honeymoon, my wife and I came back with like a case of limoncello. And it was only when I got home that I realized I actually don't like limoncello that much. But you know, when you're over there and you just get carried away and you have a bottle quite often, this is almost what happens if a Scottish distiller spent a week in Kentucky and came back with some wild ideas. I don't think this is going to be to everyone's tasting, and that's absolutely okay. But this is a whiskey that is, for us, a tool in our toolbox that we can use in vattings, in blendings with other Tomatin single malts to create really, really wonderful whiskies like the Legacy.
So let's
four
let's-
years in. Sorry, Victor.
Oh,
Spent 4
go-
years.
you
in
go ahead, then
Naples.
What?
I was just going to say that the limoncello thing. I spent 4 years in Naples, and it's the same. We used to do it every 6 months. Would come home with a bottle of limoncello, bang it in the fridge, and it always tasted terrible.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask a real American about this one. Harrison, how are you? Haven't seen you for a few weeks.
I'm Canadian, first of all. How dare you, sir?
I'm hiding.
Perfectly well, sir. How are you?
Fantastic. How else can I offend you?
Well, no, you've made it up by putting on this wonderful tasting. This is fantastic. This is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
And that Virgin, this was the Virgin Oak. Normally, I don't really go for Virgin Oak Cask, but this is fantastic. It's really, really good. It surprised me. I sort of saw it in the taster pack. I was like, nah, but it's amazing.
Is it the sort of thing you'd get in Canada?
No, we get rye, mostly rye.
I'm trying to dig myself out.
Yeah, dig up, dig up. It's all good, man.
Listen, it's good to see you.
Yeah, you too, man. You too.
I'd be curious if there's anyone in the group that doesn't like this. You know, is there anyone that this just is not working for?
I'd say it's not working. The finish is the bit I'm struggling with. It's just slightly bittery, almost peanutty. But I can imagine the palate's very, very bold. I imagine, you know, blended with the right, first, second fill, you get really interesting whiskies. But it's just the finish. It's not offensive. It's just something that's not quite to my taste. But I really like the palate.
Yeah, so on Legacy, where we do use this, it will be 85% first fill bourbon barrels, like the first whiskey, and then 15% Virgin Oak. So it's just, Legacy is bottled at around about 6-7 years old. So what the Virgin Oak does there is it just adds that extra bit of depth that you don't normally get in a 25-30 pound single malt Scotch whiskey, you know, and it's a great tool for that. We also use Virgin Oak casks in our Kubokken signature, the same level, 15%, just adds a bit of spice. But yeah, I think that's that peanut note. It's not one that I've heard before. It's not one that I've thought of before, but it actually sums up the finish quite well.
Very good. Let's get another opinion. Lee and Nicola, how are you this evening?
Good, thanks.
Hey, Nicola,
Sorry.
what do you make of the first two, the bourbon and the Virgin Oak?
The really Virgin Oak one is, I agree with what everyone's saying about the spicy banana bread. Really is. I put quite a bit of water in it. Sorry, the dog's going to start barking. Sorry.
Stop feeding it to the dog, Nicola.
I
Are you okay? Is everybody safe?
Yeah. It depends.
Is Lee with you tonight?
He is, he's just let the dog out.
Yeah, just letting the dog out.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a bit. It's really nice. The second one, it's got a lovely colour on it as well. I think. Yeah. Okay.
We're gonna have to get Chris Lodge to give you some advice on microphones, I think.
Yeah, we have got the not a very technical setup here.
Chris will sort you out. He knows all about them.
I'm just glad everyone's okay after the dog attack.
Very good.
That sounded like something out of Hollywood. That did. That was a proper like in the box noise. That, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Letting the dog out would be a good tasting note there.
So just we'll move on. I think what I was trying to get at with the Virgin Oak fitting in there is that if it wasn't for a twist of fate with the Scottish fishing industry, it could very well have been the case that this was the style of whiskey that would have been produced throughout the 19th century. But that American oak option was off the table. So distillers started looking for other options. And it just happened to be in the case of the casks that were arriving in British ports. And I think, you know, we do kind of tar over the 1800s by saying whiskey was matured in sherry casks, but it was far, far, far more complicated than that. You know, back in 1823, there were equal volumes of sherry and port imported into the United Kingdom. So 50-50 between sherry and port maturation. There's a brilliant book, and it's a great kind of quote that Scotland was knee-deep in claret throughout the 1800s, and there was huge amounts of red wine casks. So I often have a wee chuckle when people turn their nose up at red wine finishes or red wine maturations as being kind of like new and outrageous, because it was happening 150 years ago. Rum casks, brandy casks, they were all being used, but sherry casks were by and large the most prominent, and they quickly became the most favoured. Throughout the 1800s, the Brits were obsessed with sherry, truly obsessed. By 1873, there was 8 million gallons of sherry imported into the UK every year, which is just a brilliant Christmas party. In 1868, I've got a few quotes here. I've been reading into this, and some of them I think are brilliant. Some of them because of the content, but some of them because of who was writing them. In 1868, there was a kind of a weekly literary magazine that was founded and owned by Charles Dickens. I'm just going to read a little quote from it. It says, "Luxury has spread, is spreading, and probably will continue to spread as our national wealth grows, and as our middle class grows more imitative and aspiring in its social habits. A class of people now call for sherry at railway buffets, roadside inns, and country town hotels, who a few years ago would not have thought of anything better than ale. If you call on a country farmer now, he is sure to offer you port or sherry. 20 years ago, he would have drawn you a jug of ale." So it just goes to show how, you know, all-encompassing sherry became. I think when we think of it now, we think of our aunties, we think of our grannies, and we think of hipsters drinking glasses of Fino. We don't think of a time where it could have been the thing that everybody was drinking. And then 1864, William Sanderson, a distiller who went on to create VAT 69, says, "It is well known that whiskey stored in sherry casks soon acquires a mellow softness which it does not get when put into new casks. In fact, the latter, if not well seasoned, will impart a woodiness much condemned by the practiced palate." For me, that is fascinating, because that is the first that I've found point in time where we see not just wood influencing whiskey, but we see people looking at cask selection, actually selecting one style of cask based on its merits compared to other styles. Cask selection is a large part of my role now. Since I started working as a brand ambassador, I've also been working alongside Graham, our master distiller, and so a large part of my week is wrapped up in buying new casks, maturation, blending and such like. So to be able to see where the kind of roots of that part of the whiskey industry are is really, really interesting. And then one last little quote before we go on to the third whiskey. that really hammers that nail home is a man called, what's his name again, is Rufus Fleming, which is just a great name in the first place. He writes a little report called American versus Continental Oak, and it's focused largely on the beer industry in Scotland. But the passing off comment at the bottom is, very little of the best class of whiskey made in this country is put into new barrels. Old sherry casks are the prime favourite for the purpose. They sell at double the price of new casks. So not only are distillers looking for a certain type of cask, they're actively paying more for it. That was in 1899, which is 2 years after Tomatin Distillery was founded. So it ties in perfectly to kind of the world that our founders found themselves in. And when we look at that warehouse book from 1909, a huge majority of the casks being used are sherry casks. And today the trend is the same. We pay so much more for a sherry cask than we do for a new wood cask. Bourbon cask will be around about 100 to 150 pounds. Virgin Oak Cask, we're paying 200 to 250 pounds. An Oloroso sherry cask is upwards of 700 pound. If we can get a good quality sherry cask for anything less than 700 pound, we're running about like we've hit the jackpot. It's just, you don't hear of it. You know, the quality of sherry casks that we're looking for, and we're going to go on to, are 700 pound plus. So again, for me, just being a geek about all this maturation stuff, it's great to see that that was happening over 100 years ago. But that takes us on wonderfully to the third whiskey of the night, which is the Oloroso sherry cask. Again, oddly enough, American oak. I think there's a misconception that sherry casks are made with European oak. It's not the case. The vast majority of sherry casks, in fact, are American oak. But what we're doing with these casks, I love our kind of sherry cask side of things. Our sherry casks are made with a combination of both American and European oak casks. And I don't mean that we use half American and half European. The actual single cask is made up of 50-50 American and European oak staves. It's kind of a franking cask, if you will. They are then taken to the bodegas in Jerez, where for 1 year they're filled with sacrificial wine. The purpose of that wine is to draw out all of the green notes from the casks. And that eventually goes from cask to cask to cask and then becomes sherry vinegar. And that's where a lot of sherry seasoning stops, and it's where a lot of sherry seasoning gets a bad rap. What we do after that is we fill the casks for 2, 3, 4 years with 20, 25-year-old Oloroso sherry for a seasoning period. And that's very, very similar to the casks that would have been going about in the 1800s. We often look at the sherry Solera, which sits in situ, and we think that those casks that have held sherry for 50, 60 years are the casks that are being used in Scotland. And occasionally, very, very rarely, we're able to buy some. We are able to get our hands on a few of these casks, and it's always a risk, because the only reason that the bodega is selling them is because they're retiring the Solera. So there's often a case that the casks could be in poor condition, but you have to take that opportunity and take that risk. But the majority of casks that we're using are seasoned, and they replicate what was going on over 100 years ago, because the sherry would come out of the Solera, it would go into a cask, it would be transported to the UK, and then it would be the sherry would be sold and the cask would go on to the distillery. So the sherry only really spent the time of the voyage and whatever portside storage it had before going to the distillery. They were called transport casks. What we have today is kind of a replica of that. Like I say, this is one of those very, very rare occasions where we fully mature our spirit in Oloroso sherry casks. And again, being a distillery exclusive, the idea is to show you one of the ingredients in the Tomatin 12-year-old.
So we've got a pretty big sherry night next week. with Martian Schilling from Gonzalez Baez. So we've got 5 of their old and rare 30-year-old Solera sherries, and a PX brandy. Where is Mr. Hunt? Are you there? We decanted these this week.
Well, the sherries.
What was the smell like?
It was amazing. I was really enjoying the fact you were spilling half of it down the sample bottles as well, because it was sticking to my fingers, and I went home and I was just, it was brilliant.
That is a brilliant thing to experience in the UK. But a couple of years ago, I was fortunate enough to go on holiday to Jerez with a group of guys from various other distilleries. So some of you might know Peter Mackay, formerly of Morrison Mackay. He kind of set the trip up, and it was basically us and a few other brand ambassadors. And we one night we went to a bodega called Ximenez Spinola, and they produce all their wines with PX, and they were getting us to draw the sherry out of the cask with the Valencia and whatnot. And it goes everywhere, Peter, just like you were saying, all over your hands. And you're smelling your hands and going, this is incredible. That is, and then we're standing drinking their wines out in the vineyard, just enjoying them wonderfully. And you think, wow, what an experience. And then you wake up the next day and your hands are covered in mosquito bites, because the mosquitoes have just flocked to the sugar on your hands, and it's a horrible experience when it doesn't happen in the UK. I'm glad you guys don't have midges down there, because I think they would go mad for it as well.
Yeah, thanks. What do you make of this sherry Tomatin, Peter?
And definitely getting the smells that we were getting from the mash the other day on the nose. It's definitely imparted all that gorgeous sherry flavour into it. Oh, I mean, I'm a sucker for a sherry cask, as you know, but that is bloody gorgeous. It really is. I'm really impressed with that. It's not going away either.
No, it's not. What strength's this one, Scott?
Sorry, I should have said this is also from 2007. So like the Bourbon Cask, it's 13 and a half years old. These are kind of side by side in terms of age. This one's a little bit stronger than the bourbon. It's sitting at 60.9% ABV, so a little over the 60 mark. Certainly my sample is your bottle might be a little bit different. As I say, active casks, they do fluctuate a little bit, but it'll be around that mark. So it's a big, I mean, they don't get much more sherry bomb than this, to be honest.
It's proper sherry bomb. What's your opinion, Mr. Robert Harrison?
Just unmute you. There we go. Yeah, it's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Still getting the sort of hints of apple pie and that kind of thing in there, but with a few raisins thrown in on top. Yeah, I'm loving it. Absolutely loving it. Lovely.
Excellent. Excellent. Michael Mack, are you there?
I am.
Do you like a sherry bomb?
I do. I really enjoy it. I've been interested in Oloroso at the minute, trying a bit of the Glenfarclas 20-year-old and that, and I really like that sort of mellowness about the Glenfarclas. But having that, I wasn't expecting the sherry bombness of it, because I was always thinking that Oloroso was the milder of, like, say, the PX, for instance, and this is just like hit me. It's like, wow, it's just lovely, waxy, earthy, and grapey as well. It's just lovely.
What did you think of the Virgin Oak? Did you like that one?
I did. I bought that one. I was thinking while I was having it, it was more sort of like an old grain, if you get me, because it was like really vanilla-y on the nose, and the bourbon was just the same in that sort of sense. It was like, am I having a grain here? But obviously not. It's lovely, gorgeous. But all three of them's been an absolute lovely drams.
Thanks, Michael. Good to hear from you. Mr. Nick Button, how are you this evening?
I'm not so bad, Victor. Thank you very much. Yourself?
I'm good. I'm good. How are these tomato? I think you picked up a 12-year-old last time you were on the mash. Is that right?
I did indeed. Nice to see the 12-year-old. I mean, it was fine. I don't know. I think if I was going for something entry level in the Monday night whiskey, I might go for something other than Tomatin personally. But I do like in these casks. It's nice to see sort of, I guess, the distillery notes coming through more than perhaps the casks, and so you're still getting quite a bit of that sort of light fruitiness, which is nice. I think definitely I really liked the Virgin Oak. I could see a lot of sort of, I could see that link to, bourbon, a young, youthful spirit, a lot of spice, a lot of mouthfeel, nice alcohol in it. The Bourbon Cask, really enjoyed. Glad I got a bottle of that. And the Oloroso Cask is, again, it doesn't, you still got a lot of the, I guess, the Tomatin spirit coming through. It's not perhaps as much of a sherry bomb as others might be. But no, I'm really enjoying it. Thank you.
Good. Sure, yeah.
It's great to hear that, because a big part of our history as a distillery obviously is the fact that in the 70s we were the biggest distillery in Scotland, second biggest in the world, and everything that we were producing, with the exception of a small selection that was going to single malt, it was being bought by Johnny Walker, Dewar, Chivas Regal, Ballantyne's. It was all going into blend, and a big part of that was the spirit's versatility. If you wanted to make up quite well, and that's kind of, that versatility is something that's remained into our kind of modern production of the single malt brand, where we know that we can put the whiskey, the spirit, in any cask. I think it really flourishes in the bourbon cask. All those fruit flavors really come to the fore, but the sherry casks, it still holds its own. You still get that citrus note. It comes through like a little burnt orange a little bit. I think someone said that kind of cooked apple pie. It's maybe not the green apples that you get in a bourbon cask, but it's still there. It holds its own. So it's great to hear that despite 13 years in a sherry cask, it's still identifiably a Tomatin, which I think we're very, very proud to have that.
Does the elevation play into it as to why the spirit performs so well against these barrels? I mean, my first reaction was it's not as sherried as I'd expect it to be, and I guess we're all agreeing that we're getting more of the sort of base spirit through.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Scotland, 315 meters, we're the third, fourth highest distillery in the country, but it's still not exceptionally high. I know Harrison's from Canada. I remember the first time that I landed at Calgary Airport and I was still 1,500, 2,000 meters above sea level. And I was trying to tell a story about how a 300-meter distillery was high up. It's the bottom of a lake over there. So it's not exceptionally high. I think, when you talk about atmospheric pressure, it means that we can run our stills at 1 degree centigrade lower than if we were at sea level. I don't think it has an exceptionally different impact on maturation. You'll never find a salinity to a Tomatin. You'll never find any of that sea breeze kind of notes. It's always got that, for me, it's almost like heather earthiness in Tomatin. But that's more location rather than elevation. It's not close to the sea. So I think the only difference is, where Scotland has an average of 2% evaporative losses per year, we have 1.5%. So we do favour longer maturations. The whiskey matures at quite a gentle pace. For me, what it is, and it's something that I've spoke to Graham about, is the spirit itself, not necessarily how it reacts with the cask, but what's going into that spirit. So if you take a standard bottle of whiskey off the shelf, you've got 40% alcohol, you've got 59.9% water, and you have 1% congener. And all the aroma and flavour that you get in a whiskey comes from that 0.1%. That's all the other compounds that are going on that create the flavour. And I was speaking to Graham about it, and I was asking, how is it that, one thing that is really interesting, so far we've tasted whiskies that are 55.3, 62.3, 60.9%, and nobody's really said that's hot or that's harsh or that's strong. The flavour kind of dominates the strength there. And I was talking to Graham about that, and he was saying that it's just a case of we create an incredibly complex new make spirit. At the moment, our fermentation is 168 hours. That's the longest that I've ever heard of. A standard fermentation can finish at 48 hours. We're running 168. It's ridiculous. We run the stills incredibly slowly. We take a very early distillation cut. So everything that we're doing is about creating this incredibly complex new make spirit. And I think that it's not necessarily that it's reacting less with the cask. I think it's the fact that it holds its own. That spirit has so much to offer that the cask has to do a huge amount of work if it wants to overpower that spirit. And I think that's what we're seeing in some of these whiskies tonight.
Definitely try and slip us some of that new make out somehow.
I was going to ask you that, Scott. What's the chances of getting maybe a bottle of new make down? And we'll do that. We can put that in a tasting pack at some point. Yeah. We can sort that out. With any luck, I'll be able to take it down to you at some point soon. I'd love to come back down and get traveling again. So when that all opens up, that's what we'll do. The next time that we do a tasting together, I'll bring a bottle of new make spirit with me. Does that sound?
I'll pop up and I'll dunk a little Glencairn into the stream.
Yeah, that's the way to do it.
But it's a good segue into the fact that we're having a whiskey festival at the end of July. Scott, and you and Stan are almost definitely expected to appear. That's 30th and 31st of July. That's good to know. I think our company still has a travel ban at the moment, so we'll need to see how that all plays out. But I would like to say that at least by the end of the year, I'll be seeing you guys in person. So let's aim for that. But new make spirit is something to try, and actually, we're doing quite a lot of experiments at the moment. I think we could do a tasting just with different new make spirits, if people are interested in that. But that's part of another conversation.
Oh, you're tingling all of my nerd whiskey senses there with a new make spirit tasting. Definitely, I'm all over that. If nobody else is interested, I'll just take it all.
I tell you, we did that with Loch Lomond a couple of years in Remedy, and it went down superbly well. Obviously, Loch Lomond have got that weird still that they do lots of different stuff on, and I kind of turned my nose up. Actually, I was like, tasting on new make spirit, nobody will be interested. The place was full, everybody had a great time, and it was really interesting. So yes, let's plan that one in.
Nice one. And also, you've managed to do it again, Victor. You've managed to get us to sign up to another tasting that we've never ever done before. So just on that one, guys, I know you've got the Gonzalez Bias guys showing up in a little bit time. They've just opened a hotel in Jerez, so I would expect nothing less than Victor to have got you all a room for a week or something like that, the way he goes about setting these tastings up. So
I'll have to go out and inspect it first, though. Sure it's and thanks for reminding me of that, because I am going to ask.
Aye, absolutely. Find out when it's open again, because I'm going straight over there. But yeah, there we go. So that was the sherry cask. I'm more than happy to keep talking about these whiskies now, but I think I'll circle back just to finish off that kind of maturation story rather than leave you hanging high and dry. So again, I think how rapid maturation becomes a thing is incredible. From 1822, the first record of whiskey maturation, to the end of the 1800s having maturation policy in place at distilleries. That's incredibly, incredibly quick. What's also incredible about that is that at that point in time, we were not legally obliged to mature whiskey. We all know that whiskey has to be matured for a minimum of 3 years, but that didn't come into place until 1915 with the Immature Spirits Act. And it's one of the most ironic twist of fates in Scotch and particularly single malts history, because it was introduced by David Lloyd George, who was a passionate prohibitionist and a massive, massive advocate of the temperance movement. And particularly in the wartime kind of context. And he's quoted as saying that alcohol is doing more harm to the British war effort than all of the German submarines combined, which is just a fascinating quote. And there was a bit of truth to it. You know, people were showing up to munitions factories trying to create shells that took 2 weeks to produce, and they were blazing drunk, you know, so it wasn't great. But he never got his kind of full prohibition over the line, and he had to accept some compromises. And the one that they accepted was that to be called whiskey, you had to be matured for, in 1914, it was 2 years, and then in 1915, 3 years. And most reputable distillers at the time were doing that. Like I say, our warehouse book from 1909 shows a swath of maturation. All this really did was get rid of the unscrupulous distillers, and it really cemented whiskey as this kind of premier alcohol. So it catapulted whiskey to a level that it hadn't seen before. At this time, it's still very much sherry casks. But then in 1920, and I think this is the last little quote that I've got for you. In 1920, a guy called George Saintsbury writes, "I think I have noticed in the 45 years since I began to study whiskey," I love that phrase, I began to study whiskey. You know, this was a guy who had stocks of Brora, who had stocks of all these incredible lost distilleries in his warehouse. But anyway, since he began to study whiskey, that the general style of most, if not all, has changed. The older whiskies were darker in colour from being kept in golden sherry or Madeira casks, rather sweeter in taste and rather heavier in texture. The newer are lighter in both the first and the last respects, and much drier in taste. So a few things were going on at that point in time. The number of new sherry casks coming into Scotland was dropping. Phylloxera had struck Jerez at the end of the 1800s. And even in our warehouse books, we see an increasing number of second fill sherry casks. So you're getting less of that sherry influence and more of that kind of mellowing of whiskey with the wood. The second point, more rum casks are coming over to the UK. And that point where new wood from America wasn't favoured, rum, much in the same way that bourbon casks do today, seasoned the casks and kind of tempered those tannin notes. But the most important thing, and something that Saintsbury said, is that it was being driven by the consumer, not by the distiller. And what he says is the comparative disuse of the toddy and the substitution of whiskey and soda. What kind of brand ambassador would I be in 2021 without talking about whiskey and soda? You know, I just wouldn't be worth my salt if I didn't try and persuade you to all drink a highball. But no, what he was saying was effectively that the drinking habits were changing. People moved away from the kind of sweetened, honeyed toddies and were looking towards drier, carbonated whiskey and soda, or potash, as it was called at the time. And that's how we moved towards bourbon casks. And then it kind of, the nail in the sherry coffin, or the kind of, it's been tapped in, is 1935, when the Federal Alcohol Administration Act comes into place. Most of you all know, as that being the point in time where it becomes law in America that to be called a bourbon, you have to be matured in a new charred oak cask. And as the joke goes, being Scottish, deep pockets, short arms, we love a bargain, and all these new bourbon casks come onto the market and we start buying them. The real hammer in the nail of the sherry cask was 1981. Up until that point in time, the vast majority of sherry being sold in the UK was actually bottled in the UK. The casks were coming over to, think of Bristol for example, Harvey's Bristol Cream. The casks were coming over and being bottled in the UK and sold. In 1981, the law in Spain changes so that to be called sherry, you have to be bottled in Jerez. And so that's the final nail in the coffin. And that's where we get to the point in time where Scotch producers are by and large using bourbon barrels. And that takes us wonderfully on to our next whiskey, which is in 1990. And it is the oldest example we have in our warehouse of a whiskey fully matured in a first fill bourbon barrel. Up until that point in time, a lot of the casks we're using, sorry, I just realized my light went off. A lot of the casks we're using are refill casks, refill sherry, refill American oak. But in the 1990s, we start buying first fill bourbon barrels. And in normal circumstances, I would say that after about 20 years, a first fill bourbon barrel starts to overpower the spirit. You know, you probably want to be looking at a refill cask. You know, Tomatin and refill casks from the 70s and 80s is outstanding. And then I tried this, and it kind of flipped that argument on its head, because this is just a truly, truly wonderful whiskey. What you've got here is a 30-year-old single cask. And the most amazing thing about it is it's 57.5% ABV. After 30 years, it's only lost 6% of its ABV, which is crazy. I mean, the angels are thirsty for this one.
It says something about your cask selection as well, though, Scott. You must obviously be picking pretty good quality cask for the angel share to be quite tight like that.
Yeah, I mean, we've got our own cooperage on site, so they must have been working particularly hard that day, because this is the tightest cask that I've ever heard of. You know, it's pretty crazy. But yeah, I mean, most of the casks that are 30 years old, we'd expect them to be 50% ABV or less. So this is a true anomaly, but the result's brilliant. It's got, for me, all those kind of American oak notes that we got on the bourbon cask, but the oxidized fruits that we would normally only get from a refill cask. All that kind of tropical fruits.
Sorry, what was the ABV on that, Scott, please?
It's 57.5%, Wayne.
Thank you.
I mean, I've kind of I've maybe even set myself up for a fall here, because this is one of those whiskies that I can nose this for half an hour before I even try and taste it. It's one of those ever-evolving, complex, fruity whiskies. But we've still got another dram to go afterwards. So I always recommend keeping a little bit behind so that you can try them at the end. But this is outstanding. And there's a great little story that I'll tell you about this once I get your thoughts on it.
So I know, Steve Williamson, you're a big Tomatin fan. What do you make of this 1990? Something special, eh?
It's superb. Got a big, nice creaminess to it, buttery. Yeah, lovely. I've had quite a few bottles off here of the Tomatin. And I might be able to get one of these if you got one into the shop.
I'm sure we'll find you one. I'm sure.
All right.
and it'll be 30 plus years rather than the one I bought, which is
right.
20
That's beautiful. Yeah, yeah. It's one of the best things I've ever tasted.
Thank you very much. The other Steve Laidlaw, how are you getting on with it?
I'm a big Tomatin fan. My favourite whiskey is the 30-year-old, and I think there is some parallels with this one. You know, I'm getting apricots and that cream that Steve Williamson mentioned. It's quality stuff, isn't it?
It's good. It's very good. What about the Virgin Oak? Were you a fan of the Virgin Oak? Or?
I bought the Virgin Oak purely based on the fact that I'm normally seduced by bourbon and sherry, and I thought I just need to be expanding my horizons a little bit. And I think it's one of the few whiskies where I think it improved with a little drop of water. I think it opened it up a little bit, brought a little bit more of the peppery notes out. So yeah, Virgin Oak as well. I wasn't as big a fan of the Oloroso Cask. I thought, if anything, it just took away from the spirit a little bit. It was probably a little bit too dominant, which is the opposite of what a lot of people said. But that was the way I kind of felt it. I didn't get as much of the spirit coming through.
Okay. How about you, Marson in Aberdeen? What do you make of this 1990?
Oh yeah, it's great. It's fantastic ex-bourbon whiskey. Still Oloroso is better for me because I'm not a big fan of ex-bourbon whiskeys, but this one is fantastic anyway.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Who else we got? Mr. McKeague, are you able to talk this evening? Probably not.
Probably wrangling a toddler like usual.
Is that wrangling his neck or just wrangling with him?
Either or, Andy, you know. It's not like this is being recorded.
I was asking, I didn't say I was accusing myself. This is wonderful, Victor. Yeah, I agree. There's lots and lots that's similar to the standard core range 30-year-olds. It's nice, creamy, smooth, well balanced for 57. It's lush. It really is.
And what do you think about? I actually, I know it's a lot of money, but I actually think £375 in today's crazy whiskey markets is a steal for this kind of whiskey. What do you think, Andy?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, the 30-year-old core one is what, 360, so you're not really paying that much of a difference here. Yeah, both are very much worth it.
All I'll say is keep quiet because our new UK sales director is on the call, and he might change that very, very quickly. But no, you're right, and that's the comparison that I would always draw, is that our standard 30-year-old, which is a ridiculously good whiskey, it's bottled at 46%, and there's 3,000 bottles a batch, and I think we're on batch 5. You know, for £15 more, you've got a single cask at 57.5%. For me, I'm going to kind of not have a couple of pints of Tennent's this week and spend that extra 15 quid on that single cask, purely because it's one of those ones that once it's gone, it's gone. This is the last of a cask, and it's the last cask in the parcel of stock, and it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, completely agree, Scott. Just for that amount of money extra to get something that says at cask strength, it's going to be unique to the cask, so it's going to be changing every single time you get one of these. It's lovely.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's great to see a few people obviously have tried the 30-year-old to be able to compare it. For me, the comparison, it's quite a difficult thing to articulate, but it is an aroma that, just as a quick show of hands, has anyone here been to Tomatin Distillery before?
Mm-hmm.
It's quite a few people, folk. That's great. Hopefully the rest of you get to come up after lockdown finishes and all that. And those that have been before, absolutely come back. But those that have been there will have had this wonderful moment where at the end of the tour, the door of warehouse 6 is open and they walk into this 125-year-old dunnage warehouse that is just spilling with aroma. It's just 125 years of evaporation fired towards your nostrils. And I very often use warehouse 6 or dunnage warehouse as a tasting note for these older whiskies. But unless you've been there, it's very difficult to understand what that is. So I'm going to try and, you know, when you say dunnage, the things that in a dunnage warehouse that give it that flavour are the fact that it's damp, it's mouldy, it's got fungus in it. That's not particularly exciting. The aroma is what would happen if you walked into a second-hand bookshop and smashed a pineapple on the floor. The worrying thing about that is that when you're trying tasting notes, all you're really doing is saying what you remember. So I don't know where that tasting note came from. But yeah, that's what it is for me. Smashing a pineapple in a second-hand bookshop. It's got that dusty but fruity.
I've got a quick question about it, Scott. For me, I mean, it's a lovely dram. I agree with Michael. I get a little bit of tobacco on it as well. Lovely fruits. It's a real kind of front forward mouthfeel for me, but funnily, I get this kind of intense heat. It's not spiciness, but I get the top of the mouth. I get this kind of intense heat on the top of the mouth, which doesn't feel like spice. It feels like something else. It's quite unusual. Another question I had is the Oloroso. My initial thoughts on that, on the nose, was lactose, like a sour milk. And it's the only dram we've had so far. I've got that lactose. Usually if you get that lactose with me, it's through the character of the distillery. But the Oloroso was the only one that I actually picked that out on the nose of. The rest of them, I don't have that lactose. Where do you think that would come from?
So where that would come from, I mean, it would, the reason that I would find it would stand to reason that it would be in all the whiskies. So with a long fermentation like we have, after 48 hours, the yeast has done its job. It's created your 8% alcohol. And what you're doing by leaving the wash in the washback for any longer than that is allowing lactic acid bacteria to build up. And it's that lactic acid bacteria that develops a fruity note. So if you come to Tomatin and you try fermentation at 48 hours, you're going to get something resembling a cheesecake base. That kind of malty but sweet flavor is quite nice, but it's just a basic level. If you come back a couple of days later, once we're getting into 100, 120, 160 hours, you get, for me, it's like if you've ever tried like a Belgian goose beer, that kind of gooseberry, like sour pineapple flavor, that's where that comes from. And it is lactic acid that creates that. So that might be where that comes from. But like I say, you would expect then, certainly on the bourbon cask, to experience it because it's the same age of spirit. Nothing's really changed. So I'm not entirely sure. But as with all the things with tasting notes and that is, I can never tell you you're wrong and I can never tell you you're right because it is personal experience. And what we're asking people to do when they're smelling a whiskey is answer the question, other than whiskey, what does this remind me of? And that's a great thing because I can't, for me to tell you that you're wrong would be like me saying your memory is incorrect. How dare you? You know, it would be a ridiculous statement. So I totally appreciate that. No, it's not something I personally get. And that's the only place I can kind of justify where it may come from. As for the heat on the 1990, I know what you're saying. It's not like a spice. It's almost kind of deep heat, that sort of muscular heat. And I can only say that that's because if you have a 57.5% whiskey that's got 30 years of cask maturation, we know that alcohol is a carrier of flavor. So that strength with that intense a maturation, it's going to have that kind of radiating heat. And hopefully that's answered those kind of points.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thanks. I mean, this is the first time actually I've tasted Tomatin, and some of these whiskies are outstanding, I must say.
You jump in right at the deep end. There was no kind of entry level there, was there?
I can't. You've been with us for almost a year, Wayne, and you've never had Tomatin. Where have you been?
I know. It's just one of those ones that have slipped the radar, really. And I ordered the bourbon, and I mean the bourbon was beautiful, but then we went on to the Virgin, and I just found that Virgin was just stunning for me because I like that kind of spiciness of the.
I think we've opened a new
rye whiskies.
Life.
Yeah, I mean it's brilliant. I think you found a new convert anyway.
Good stuff. So I am going to ask a real American about what she thinks about these. Harrison's just a pretend Canadian, I think. Margot, how are you this evening, and what do you make of this 1990?
So I'm loving this 1990, I have to say. And I don't think I've ever spent this much on a bottle, and I'm actually thinking about this is really worth it. And for those of you collecting going, this is nothing for a bottle, this is amazing. And I like the first Bourbon Cask as well. So yeah, there's just something about it that's so Moorish.
There is. I think I'm going to get another bottle. Because we've got a new sales director who we could rapidly fall out with if you've been surprised.
I'm going to try and kick that ball over the line there then, because the story of this whiskey goes kind of beyond a whiskey, and it goes beyond coincidence into one of these magical whiskey stories. So our master distiller, Graham Unson, selects all the casks that are bottled as the distillery exclusive. He lets us all try them, and he kind of goes and says that everyone's had a vote in it, but ultimately he goes, no, this is the one that I like, and he puts it in the visitor centre. And it just so happens that this whiskey, which was distilled on the 24th of September 1990, was the very same day that Graham started his career in the whiskey industry. Now, I know what you're thinking, what an egomaniac, you know, who does that? He didn't realize it. It was only in May 20, so this cask, because of the price point, has been one of our casks for a few years. It was only in May, a couple of years ago, when he was promoted to master distiller. His daughter, Kirsty, and his son, Scott, they both work at the distillery as well, or Kirsty did. She worked in the visitor centre. Scott's one of our stillmen. Kirsty is now the site operations manager at Glenkinchie, so small world and all that. But they decided, you know, Dad's just been promoted to master distiller, let's get him a bottle. And they bought a bottle of this and they gave it to Graham. He said, oh, wow, that's really, really kind of you. And he said, that date, that distillation date, did you just make that up? And she's like, no, how was it? Is it wrong? And he's like, no, that's the day I started. It's the day that I drove up to Scapa Distillery for the first time. And so the next Monday he gets to the distillery and he checks the stock sheet, and sure enough, it's the day that he started in the whiskey industry, which is a great excuse for me to talk about Graham, and I'll never get tired of that. He started his career, like I say, 29th of September 1990 at Scapa Distillery. He's from Orkney originally. Started off as a joiner, ended up as a brewer, and he was at Scapa Distillery until it shut down in 1994. He then moved to Glendronach Distillery and worked there for a few years. And then Glendronach Distillery shut down as well. And anyone that's been to a Tomatin tasting so far will know the joke that's coming up, because, I mean, I'm not very creative and the jokes stay the same. But he moved on to Glenmorangie Distillery and he worked there for about 13 years. And it was the 13 years where Bill Lumsden was the distillery manager. And then Bill eventually got promoted to the kind of master distiller, master of wood and all that thing, and pulled Graham aside one night after a shift and said, I'm being promoted. Would you like to be the distillery manager? And Graham, absolutely, blown away, but absolutely. So he became the distillery manager at Glenmorangie, which also ties into our history a wee bit here, because after the 1980s, conceivably sherry casks could have been gone for good if not for producers like Glenmorangie and Balvenie, who started this trend of finishing and cask maturation that we find ourselves in today. I often liken those two distilleries to the craft brewing industry. You know, when you look at a lot of these like imperial stouts and things that you get to drink now, they would have been totally decimated if the craft brewing industry never brought back old recipes. And distilleries like Glenmorangie and Balvenie, they did that for whiskey maturation. And Graham was the guy on the ground filling all those casks. And as he tells it, no matter how hard he tried, he could not get Glenmorangie Distillery to shut down. But Glenmorangie continued to be the success it was, and Graham was approached with a new challenge. After having shut two distilleries, Scapa and Glendronach, he was asked, would you like to reopen one? And he leapt at that opportunity. So anyone that's enjoyed a glass of Glenglassaugh in the last few years has Graham to thank. He was the man that reopened Glenglassaugh Distillery when it was owned by the Russians. And he's got a few interesting stories about the way that they would land in their helicopters and look at their marvelous distillery, and then a couple of years later sell it to Billy Walker. And so when it was sold, he decided, right, time to find a new Glenmorangie, effectively a new love. And that's when he joined Tomatin as originally distillery manager and now master distiller. So I do think it is, you know, it's a pretty incredible thing that this whiskey has turned 30 at the same time that he's gone from first day in the industry to master distiller. I think that's a truly romantic thing. Total coincidence. But does it make the whiskey any better? No, but it's given me something to talk about while you've been enjoying it. So hopefully that's worked.
Well, mine's all gone. I'm going to have to, it didn't last long in the glass.
I've moved mine out of arm's reach so I can come back to it.
You say that doesn't make the whiskey taste any better, Scott, but those kind of stories are, for me, 100% part of whiskey. And if it wasn't for the heritage and stories of whiskey, I don't think I would enjoy it as much.
I totally agree. I think it's the reason that Scotch whiskey particularly, I know we've got someone with the tag name @BourbonRich on here, but it's for me the reason that Scotch whiskey is kind of unrivaled in its kind of, not even necessarily the quality of the liquid, but the romanticism that goes along with it and the passion. I don't think you see people passionate about any other spirit in the way that they are about Scotch whiskey, particularly beyond what's in the glass, the stories, the history, the way it's created. I think, like you say, that those little stories, they make whiskey what it is. And I've spoken to Graham a few times about the fact that he had no hand in creating this whiskey. If this was his first day at Scapa, he was nowhere near Tomatin Distillery on the 24th of September 1990. And I've often spoken to him about what is it like to be responsible for whiskey that people who are long gone produced. You know, you are the way that he kind of approaches it is like he's a custodian of a museum. But that museum just happens to be incredibly tasty, and he gets to, you know, select the casks that are the results of other people's labours and the fruits of other people's labours and present them to people. So, and that's not a unique thing to Tomatin. I think it's why all single malt is special.
How are you enjoying the Tomatin, Garson?
Well, I don't know if you can remember the Grand Dramen, sorry, the double Grand Dramen, when we had the Tomatin 36, which I believe was my one and only Tomatin. And that night, I was standing up against some pretty spectacular drams in that lineup, and I thought it was up there with the Bunnahabhain, and obviously this is the first time I met Scott. Just to let you know, I'm more of a peat fan than I am sherry or bourbon or anything like that. And whereas I enjoyed the first 3 drams, I struggle with cask strength as well because I've not been doing this very long. But a wee bit of water, you know, transforms these into something that I could drink probably most days. I think they're kind of, for me, they feel as if they're winter drinks for me. I don't know if that's anything you've heard before, but this one, I think this is a fantastic dram. And I just remember drinking that Tomatin 36 and going, wow, you know, it's so complex. And as you say, when you said the throwing the pineapple on the bookshop floor, I laughed because I almost imagined a King Charles Spaniel rolling about in the pineapple and jumping up on a Chesterfield sofa just to finish that note off. You know, it's that musty, that just heritage, and that dram with that story, I think makes that a perfect dram. Perfect.
It's one of those whiskies, like the 36-year-old, when you try it and you can say, that tastes old, you know, that tastes of maturation. And God only knows what that actually means, but it does taste old. But yeah, I think I love that point that although you're a big fan of peated whiskey, that there's a level of complexity here that you're able to appreciate and enjoy as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to, I'm not a snob about whiskey at all. In fact, it's one of the things I'm really not fond of. And a blind tasting, I like to think I would have picked that one out. No problem at all. And I guess it's not to be compared to the other 3 because it's a different whiskey. And I do think it's It's different in complexity. The finish for me is one of the best, because the other three finishes, I think the alcohol for me kind of takes over a bit, whereas that, and it's not far off the ABV, that it's different in the finish. So no, I think it's fantastic. Can I just ask how many bottles are left in that cask?
It's a very good question. Does anyone here have a bottle of it and can tell me what that bottle number is? Because that cask's been there for a while now, and we must be on to the last few bottles. So whoever's got a bottle, I know Victor's going looking now, but I mean, it looks like the most complicated place to find a bottle in, doesn't it?
I know what my 1990 is.
You can smell it out from there. Don't you worry about that.
I know exactly where my 1990 is. It's bottle number 94 that I have.
Right. And was that the 2019 or the 2021 one?
That's the 21. That's good, because you guys wrote Southport Whiskey Club on them.
Right.
Well,
So there'll be, based on that, I would say there's probably about 100 bottles left in that cask.
Well, I can tell you, I'm trying to think I think it might be downstairs. My 2019. I think the 2019 is from a different cask, but it was distilled on the same day.
That would surprise me, because my understanding is this is the only 1990 cask that we've ever had in the visitor centre. I could be wrong, but I'd like to find out.
I'm going to nip. It might be downstairs. I might have taken it up to the mash. I'm not sure where it is.
Yeah.
Actually, it might be in the car. Peter, did we have it this afternoon?
Right. So the stuff that we put in the car, we put in a bottle of all the stuff that is from tonight. That's going to the mash.
You guys stay there. Why don't you get onto this PX? And we've tasted the PX in Southport Whiskey Club before. It goes down an absolute storm, makes everybody smile. You get stuck into that, and I'm going to go and look for my other 1990.
Let's do it.
Bill and Rich are in charge.
Before we do that, Peter, I think you should tell us why you and Victor are driving around with 30-year-old whiskey in the car at a lockdown.
We're not driving around with 30-year-old whiskey. That was the youngest whiskey that was in the back of the car.
Scott, just before we move on, what will you do with those distillery casks when they're empty?
Depends on what one it is. I would say, that first fill bourbon barrel from 30 years ago isn't going to have much left in terms of extractives or flavor. I would say that one's probably going straight to one of our warehouse guys who he builds chairs and picture frames out of casks and stuff. So that cask's probably going to him. The bourbon cask, the Virgin Oak, the sherry cask, the PX cask will all be refilled. It's unlikely that they themselves will then go on to be bottled as single casks. They'll fit into other recipes and things, but we'll make use of them. But I just wanted to go back to one of the points you made there about that kind of winter whiskey, and I think certainly this whiskey, the Virgin Oak and the Oloroso sherry, for me are kind of, I know some of you are in a heat wave at the moment. Up in Scotland, it's grey, it's windy, it's raining, it's absolutely horrible. It's the classic dreich spring weather that we get. These whiskies are going down a storm. That first whiskey, though, that bourbon cask, I cannot wait until barbecue weather. That is going to be the whiskey for me for the summer. That first whiskey that we had with all that fresh fruits. I'm going to enjoy that massively. So.
Listen, see, before you make that cask into furniture, I'd love to speak to you about putting some you make spirit in that, because I don't think that cask's done at all. And I think the Tomatin spirit has got a lot to lend to something else. I've filled a 1988 Caperdonic last year, and everybody thought that was going to be a real long maturation, and it might not work. But with the spirit that's in it, it's coming into life already. And it's definitely doing something to the spirit that's in it. So I think it'd be a shame to put that in someone's garden as a chair or a table, albeit it would be very nice to look at. That's the end of the story for that, and I would take that.
I honestly think, do you know what? I think it would be a great table in Graham Unson's garden. That would be quite a nice little thing.
Yes.
That would make sense. But actually, you're right. There's a conversation to be had, because, as Peter said, we know this is a quality piece of wood. I mean, to only lose 6% over 30 years, that kind of is magical. I don't know. I want to know exactly what spot in the warehouse it's in and who's put the kind of freezer underneath it, and you know where the cling film's at, because it shouldn't. It defies all logic. So you're maybe right. There's maybe another little bit of life to be had out of that cask. I don't think we'll ever see another single cask out of that cask, though. You know, I don't think it will be of the quality that can be bottled as a single cask.
Well, perhaps if you can give me a couple of minutes at sometime in the future, I'll tell you what my thoughts are, and you can
Absolutely.
maybe some people, and we'll see what we can do.
Absolutely. Feel free to get in touch. And all of you, I know, you know, there's plenty of time for questions tonight, and absolutely make sure you get them in. But if not, and if you think of something afterwards or that, you can get in touch with me very easily. My email address is scott@tomatin.com. It doesn't get much more easy than that. So please feel free to reach out if you've got any questions after this. But I think, you know, are we all ready to move on to that fifth whiskey?
Yeah, let's do it.
You're not waiting for Victor?
There we go. Right on cue.
I've drawn a blank. I can't find it. It must be up at the mash.
I think you might have already took it up to the mash.
Yeah.
Is it one of the ones you glued down?
No, it's one of the ones I took before he glued down.
I'm not leaving it. I'm not leaving it up there though.
Me and Peter have got a fine art of just spreading the bottles out a little bit when we take one.
So yeah, Scott, do you mind asking just before you start? So we got up to, like, was it 1981? We were talking about sherry cask. So after that, it became a lot harder to get a sherry cask over here, and obviously distilleries started using things like Paxarette to season their casks.
Yep.
I don't know if you know the history of that sort of side of it. I mean, did Tomatin sort of veer onto the side of using Paxarette to season the casks, or was it sort of did they just go straight into bourbon and think, you know, forget about it, it's too much hard work?
Yeah, so Paxarette, for those that aren't aware, was like a heavily sun-ripened musty grape syrup that would be run through casks, and then the cask would be emptied of that, and it would have this seasoned kind of sherry. Effectively, it was caramel coloring before we had caramel coloring, and it just so happened to have some incredible flavor. So much so that there's stories around Speyside and stuff like that of distillery workers' wives queuing up in the week before Christmas to get the Paxarette, because it was the secret ingredient in their Christmas cake and stuff like that, you know. But eventually the Scotch Whisky Association, I believe in 1990, outlawed Paxarette and said it was an additive. I can't remember who I was listening to recently, but with the new Scotch Whisky cask regulations, you know, Paxarette in and of itself is a legitimate wine. It wasn't just produced for whiskey casks, you know. So are genuine Paxarette casks allowed to be used in the same way that sherry casks are? It's a question that I want to be asking and finding out, because even if we do it for one, you know, what a distillery exclusive that would be.
That is really quite interesting. I'd love to try a Paxarette cask whiskey. That would be really interesting.
Me too. And the biggest problem that we have, and the biggest problem that every distillery has, is that before 2000, nobody really kept much of a record of their casks. You know, we had, like I say, our 1900s warehouse book, and it told you first fill, second fill sherry, but it never told you if that was Fino, Manzanilla, Amontillado, Palo Catardo, Oloroso PX. It never told you the style. So warehouse records were loose, to say the least. Tomatin, though, I don't think there was a huge amount of Paxarette going on. And even when I look back at our casks, the sherry casks that we have prior to 1990, their finishes, you know, or second fills, their refills. We don't have I can't think of even one cask that is a fully matured Oloroso sherry cask from before 1990. So that kind of rules out that Paxarette thing. And for us, you know, everything that we were producing, the intention at that time was that someone's going to blend it somewhere. And shamelessly, almost 1970s, 1980s, it was a case of fill whatever you've got. because it's going to be Johnny Walker in 3 years' time, you know. Now, the result of that, fortunately for us, is that those refill casks then go on to oxidize incredibly, so that when we look at our 1970s stock now, which is refill hogsheads, 40 years old, it is unparalleled in terms of quality, in terms of that tropical explosion of fruits. But that wasn't because we were picking the best casks at the time. It was because there was a lot of oxidation involved. And I'm waffling a little bit, but to the point that you make, as of the 1980s, sherry casks could have totally disappeared if it hadn't been for a number of distilleries inventing, so to speak, the seasoned sherry cask, you know, which was, its goal was to replicate what a transport sherry cask would do. The biggest criticism of seasoned sherry casks compared to transport casks is that transport casks were holding the wine that was ready to be bottled, and that seasoned casks are often using immature wine. That's why, like I say, when we're seasoning casks, we're using 20, 25-year-old Oloroso sherry, because we want something as close to we would have got in the 1890s as possible.
Yeah, but you can't wait that long for a cask to mature, and when you buy a cask like that, it's going to be ridiculously expensive.
Yeah, and again, that's why we're spending 700 quid on a sherry cask, because it's got 20-year-old sherry in it rather than 1-year-old, you know. Worth it.
Yeah, because it was the whole idea of Paxaret as well, just to go down a nerdy sort of line, was there was a vague idea of what a freshly wet dumped cask was, wasn't there? So they could chuck in half a dozen bottles of Paxaret, maybe more, depending on what it was, and that was a wet cask, and that would obviously have a stronger effect on the spirit that was in the cask.
Yeah, and I think a big part of it as well was, you know, you get your fresh sherry cask from in the 1960s, for example, and then by the time you refill that in the 1970s or the 1980s, there's not a huge amount of sherry influence there. And, you know, let's fire in a couple of bottles of Paxaret, shake it about a little bit, and run with it. It was almost in many ways, it's kind of similar to what we do with bourbon casks that are tired when we dechar and rechar them. You know, you try and rejuvenate them. Paxaret was trying to rejuvenate sherry casks a little bit.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. Sorry, guys, I just wanted to go down a nerdy avenue there. So should we drink some more whiskey?
Let's do it. And let's get on to a non-Paxaret incredible sherry cask. And it kind of brings us full circle to where we are in the 21st century, where finishing is a thing, but where exploring historic cask types is also at the core of what we do. And like I say, when I'm looking at new casks that I want to bring in, and when I'm looking at experimentations that I want to do, a lot of it is driven by what casks did we use in the past, and can we recreate those styles? But what we've got now, it's outrageous. It's from 2001. It's a 19-year-old. For the first 10 years, it was in refill hogsheads. And then for the last 9 years, since 2010, it's been in a Pedro Ximenez sherry butt. We often talk about long finishing at Tomatin, but 9 years, that's double maturation. Half of its life has been in that PX sherry cask. We've tried Tomatin fully matured in PX casks, and it's not as complex as this. This whiskey, you know, the whiskey industry is mad for awards and stuff like that. I often think that unless it's like-minded people, the award is a nice thing to have, but it doesn't really tell you much. Some of you might know the Scotch test dummies, Scott and Bart from over in America, who very much started off as new whiskey drinkers, and they've just gone ham hock on the whole thing. A couple of years ago, they had what they called a Merry Sherry Shootout in the run-up to Christmas, and they picked 16 sherry matured whiskies and tasted them double blind, and both of them picked the Tomatin PX Distillery exclusive as the winner of that. So it fended off the likes of Macallan's and Glendronach's and Glenfarclas's to be their favourite sherry matured whiskey. And it was a finish. You know, that is testament to the art of what we're doing at Tomatin. It's testament to how Graham approaches maturation. But 53.7% ABV. And quite simply is the kind of, for me, the ultimate sherry matured whiskey, particularly the ultimate PX sherry matured whiskey.
Yeah, we had Stan brought some bottles down for us maybe 3 years ago, and I think he brought 2 or 3 bottles of this PX, and we did them one night in Remedy with the club. This PX, you could have brought a van load of it down. Everybody wanted it.
Yeah.
As you say, it's it would come top of the tree in most sherry lineups.
Yeah, and I don't know if the Gonzalez bias guys are going to share a PX with you, but for those of you that maybe aren't in that taste,
they're going to do a no. They're going to do a no.
Okay, wonderful. So they'll tell you a lot more about this than I can, because I'm not going to lie, I was drunk for the vast majority of both of my trips to Jerez. So my memory is shrouded in incredible sherry. But Pedro Ximenez sherry is the sweetest wine on planet Earth. It is 450 grams of residual sugar per litre. Putting that into perspective, Coca-Cola is only 120 grams. It's like 4 times as sweet as Coca-Cola. And when you pour yourself a glass of PX, it looks like castor oil. Absolutely try a glass of it, but the best way to consume PX is over vanilla ice cream. You're on a different level of luxuriating if you do that, but it's quality. But you know, some of the flavors from PX that I describe are like licorice, tobacco, leather. So although it's an incredibly sweet wine, some of the flavors are things that you would describe as bitter. Coffee, it's like Kahlua a little bit in terms of that coffee liqueur flavor. So that's why by starting off for 10 years in those refill bourbon barrels, we still get an element of sweetness that we wouldn't otherwise have.
So I love Frangelica over vanilla ice cream. So is it better than that?
It's better than anything you've ever tried.
Yeah, you got to put PX on vanilla ice cream.
This is great for my alcoholism. It's just fantastic. It's just another way to enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, definitely give it a go.
We're already using 3 bottles of wine in a spag bowl.
Well, if you've got even if you get any kind of cake, you know, instead of putting cream on it, put some PX on it.
Yeah,
and it just soaks up. It's just goodness.
I just want to say, Rich, I'm going to trade you a bottle of New Mix Spirit for a plate of spag bol at your house.
Yeah, well, I do all the cooking here. You're more than welcome anytime you want.
Rich, I'm guessing that's why your kids are asleep and Andy McKean's kids aren't asleep.
My kids all go down at 7 every night, mate, and they get up at 8 in the morning and have done since they were 6 weeks old.
Yeah, after a good spag bol.
Just full of new make.
I wish I could say the same, Rich.
And he's looking for a recipe.
The only way I can demonstrate mine is to walk into the nursery and show you a sleeping baby, but that won't help you.
So, been very quiet tonight, Mr. Chris Arnott. Are you still with us? He's gone. He's definitely gone. Definitely gone. It kind of leads.
He's still in the shop buying the rest of these up.
Kind of leads me to the.
There he is. He's back.
Was he back?
Returned.
We're asking you questions, Mr. Chris Arnott. Are you there?
Oh, sorry, Victor. I happened to just pop out briefly there just now, but I have to say I've been thoroughly enjoying all these Tomatin whiskies. One of my all-time favourite distilleries, I have to say. So, I actually was going through my list here, thinking which one have I liked best, and unfortunately, they're all kind of really competing quite heavily for it at the moment. I have to say I like the bourbon finishes.
Yes, I do. I like the first one, and that 1990 is a stinker.
Just extraordinary. I have to say, really, really fantastic. the PX is challenging me a little bit here, because I quite like the Oloroso, and it's quite nice getting that kind of PX kind of finish. And I split it into 2 glasses, chucked a bit of water in one of them, tried to kind of weigh it up a little bit, get a bit of toffee, a bit of treacle notes. And then people were chucking in beefy saltiness, and I'm saying, no, I'm not quite getting that. Why am I not getting that kind of thing? And then, you know, so it's just genuinely been a fantastic tasting, the whole thing here. So I'm still sitting with various samples in the glasses here, so I'm going to be here for some hours yet.
Just when you said about the bourbon there, Chris, I went back and tried the very first whiskey, and that bourbon matured Tomatin, it's like a glass of lemon curd after trying this PX. I do think that for me, whiskey is better. So this is something I want to run past you. And Victor, this might be another tasting that we do down the line. Part of my job over the last couple of years has been coming up with, you know, whiskey and beer pairings and whiskey and food pairings and stuff like that. For me, the best way to enjoy whiskey is whiskey and whiskey pairings. Because you see, when you try 2 whiskeys side by side, you go from something like that bourbon to this PX. After you've tried that PX, the flavors that you get out of the bourbon are totally different. So my plan is to kind of build a whiskey and whiskey pairing. I think that's a great idea.
What are you taking your whiskey? More whiskey?
Yeah, no food in sight. It's like 12 whiskies instead of 6.
What about we pair like for like bourbons with and ryes with these? That would be pretty cool. Like I'm already, because I'm on a bourbon chat here telling everyone how great this stuff is, and they're all going, yeah, I fucking hate Scotch. Sorry, we're on live. Sorry. And I'm saying, well, I could match these, mark these with bourbons, and I think these blow most of the BTACs, Pappies, all that sort of buzz. I think it blows most of those out of the water. I think these are absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
That's a brilliant shout, because you do get the whiskey drinkers that won't go to bourbon, and you do get the bourbon drinkers that won't go to whiskey. So I think that will be a great way.
We've got some stuff as well that we could do it with. Like the EC18 is a great one to stand up against these. We've got some of that.
Great whiskey.
I mean, we've got the new one, which apparently is just fantastic. So we've got some stuff and we've got some stuff coming that's interesting. So we could definitely do that.
Yeah, let's give it a go. Let's give it a go.
It's a great idea. My relationship with bourbon is quite a weird one. So I've got in excess of 100 bottles of single malt Scotch in the house, and they occasionally, I'll do the rounds and take a dram out of them But the moment that a bourbon hits the house, it doesn't even have to be something special. A couple of years ago, I got a lovely Elijah Craig barrel proof when I was out in California, outstanding. But even a Maker's Mark on offer in Morrison's right now, I got that about 2 weeks ago, and half the bottle's gone. I drink that when it's in the house the way that my wife drinks gin. You know, I have a different relationship with bourbon than what I do to single malt, where with single malt I'll sit and sip with a nosing glass. Bourbon I feel like I can relax a little bit more with, which is interesting.
100% agree, and that's why I'm liking Scotch, because I'm slowing down on it. I get nothing but grief about the 10 drams a night I have a bourbon, but yeah, bourbon's really quaffable. It's that sugary sort of thickness to it. It's so easy. But I mean, we've got some of that barrel proof, that Elijah Craig barrel proof. We've got some of that as well. So yeah, that'd be really cool. I'd really love to do that with you guys. That'd be ace.
Well, the tasting we've got tomorrow night, Rich, we're doing a charity tasting. We're pretty much doing that, aren't we?
Yeah, we've got two single barrel bourbons in there from New Riff and Wilderness Trail, and then we've got the Glenfarclas 20 SWC pick. We've got the Balvenie.
We've got the Balvenie ton, and we've got the Kaila 9.
Yeah, so whack a little tiny bit of subtle peat in there. That's a really good drum. That one. So.
Tiny bit.
I think it's mellow though. It's a mellow. So yeah, but that would be really cool.
Cool. Listen, I want to bring back my old pal Stan, because really it's his fault that we're all here tonight. I met Stan about 4 years ago in the Soho Club, and he blew me away with a tasting that just got better and better. I think I've told this story before. He got to the 18-year-old, and I thought, it doesn't get much better than that. Tomatin 18-year-old is superb. And then he pulled a 30-year-old out, which was absolutely exceptional. And then he did a 36-year-old, which I thought, man, it's got to be over the hill. But as Andy McKeek said earlier on, it's far from it. Stan, what have you made of this evening?
Well, I've loved it, and I think Scott does a wonderful. It's just been a wonderful tasting, but what you've actually added to is some history that probably nobody knew things about. And I think, you know, I think that's a great thing, that mix and marriage of that history and off-piste whiskies as well that we had tonight as well, because it's not something I sell. And you know me, Victor, I love selling. So I do. So by the way, I'll slip it in now, by the way, just so if anybody wants any more whiskies tonight, just pick up the phone or drop them an email and we'll certainly get some stuff down to you. Don't worry about that.
Well, we've got them all on the website, so there's quite a few orders come through, Stan. So I will be tomorrow to get the people at the distillery to send some more.
I'm sure that the new sales director's listening to that as well, and that'll be music for him too. But yeah, no, it's just been a right nice evening to sit back and chill and just, you know, watch Scott perform. And I think the interesting thing about tonight as well, everybody's sort of comments were all sort of different, you know, and it's just great. And the wonderful thing is, Wayne, where are you? Wayne, we've got a new kid on the block here, like in Tomatin now.
Yeah.
So I'm sure
absolutely.
I'm sure he'll order some tomorrow as well with Victor.
I think I will do. Yeah, I think that's been one of my highlight tastings of the year, actually.
Great to hear. Well, I can only say thank you to you all, really, and hopefully we'll get face to face.
Yeah,
catch up sometime.
We're gonna have to talk to your boss, Gordon. Gordon, are you still around?
Still here, yeah.
Yeah. So what with this travel ban? You know, late July, we'll all be vaccinated. We'll all be drinking, you know, cask strength Tomatin. We'll all be outside in the sun, safe as houses.
Yeah, I think what Scott said is yes, we'll have conversations as and when we're getting through this thing. But I would just like to say this is my first official Tomatin tasting. I'm actually still in a bit of a transition period where I haven't been up to Tomatin Distillery for a while, but I've not been up yet for my first days with the company. So this for me has been fantastic to listen to Scott and his stories he tells, the amazing history he's got on not just Tomatin and people that work there, but the industry itself. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. So thanks, Scott. I really enjoyed sitting and listening to the stories. And personally, I just feel very lucky to be coming to work for a distillery like this. I've been with another distiller for many years, and I always said it would take an awful lot to peel me away from where I've come from. But I've had a long relationship with Tomatin at festivals and outings, and Alistair Much, who Stan gave a nod to earlier on, was a long-term friend of mine, and we always made a point of seeking each other out whenever we could at these festivals, what have you, because we're big fans of each other's products. So I'm now just feeling very lucky to be a part of this going forward, and there's some really good stuff in the offing. So I can wet your whistle of what I know so far. This is only the beginning of some really amazing liquid that's going to be coming to our doors. So thanks very much, Scott. Really appreciate that. And Stan, great job getting this set up. And
it's been a pleasure. It's just been a pleasure. I think,
jump in on that before you do, Stan. I told Gordon about this tasting, and I thought it'd be a great, let's get Gordon involved and stuff like that. He's learned nothing about Tomatin Distillery tonight, and he's never even had a sample pack in front of him. So he's just heard me talking about the history of maturation for 2 hours now. So all credit to you for Gordon for hanging about for so long.
No, it's been nothing but a pleasure, Scott. Really, really good. Thank you.
I think what I'll just leave you with from another selling point of view again is that watch your space for 3 limited editions. It's going to be out sort of late April, early May. A French trio. I'll say nothing else. Just watch your space. Okay.
Just make sure you keep me a couple of cases of each, please, Stan.
No, I've written that down already.
Thank you. Okay. Listen, thanks for coming on, Gordon. It's lovely to meet you, and I'm sure we'll have lots more fun with you and the boys and Tomatin going forward. Just want to open out to the room, just kind of before we kind of shut the recording off. Does anyone want to make a comment or ask a question of the three guys from Tomatin tonight?
I think it's just, Victor, we have T-shirts now. So if you just send a couple of T-shirts to Scott and Gordon and they just happen to be driving past at the end of July, nothing to do with work, is it? Nothing to do. And if they happen to have a few bottles in the car, Southport T-shirts, we'll say nothing, they'll say nothing.
Do you know, it's incredible. Me and my wife were talking about it today, and, you know, we love Italy and we can't wait to go on holiday. And it just so happened that we talked about a holiday to Southport in July, of all crazy times.
You know, it makes sense.
It was the original Paris, Scott. I mean, you don't need to go to Europe, you know. Paris was based on Southport. Let's not forget that.
Well, true little fact I kind of kept back from Scott and from Stan was that I'm actually a sand grinder myself. I was born in Southport and lived there for all 6 months of my life prior to being hooked back up to Scotland by my family. And I am the only member of my family from either side or from any of the family trees that we can look back that have been born south of the Scottish border, which is brought up quite frequently at family get-togethers. But well, I'm actually a bit of a sand grinder myself, so I do have to say I do enjoy coming down, and I do have a Southport football strip as well.
That makes you a Lancashire single cask, because you can't be born in Southport anymore. You have to get shipped out to Ormskirk to have a baby.
Well, yeah, well, I must be a good vintage then.
Very good. All the more reason. So we'll leave it there. Anyone else got any further comment or questions?
Honestly, just brilliant. I enjoyed the fact that Scott, it wasn't really a curveball. I just sort of decided to nerd out with you when you mentioned about the sherry cask thing, and you're all over it. You really know your stuff. Like, I'm really impressed. I learned a lot tonight. So just thank you, because it's been fantastic.
Well, thank you very much. I love nothing more than a geek out. I love that. What I love more about it is when someone's at their first ever whiskey tasting and someone's asking about Pax Arette, and it's just shutters. But no, great to have I love a wide manner of conversations and questions, and tonight has been just that. It's why we love coming back to Southport Whisky Club, and why whenever Victor picks up the phone, we're going to find 5 whiskies that you've never tried before.
Superb. Listen, thanks guys. I'm going to stop the recording, and you can all start swearing if you wish.